The summer of 1936 was a furnace, a heat that felt like it came from the very heart of the earth. It wasn't just the sun that blistered the olive groves and cracked the soil of Castile, but a different kind of fever, a fire that was burning through the veins of a country as it began to tear itself apart, limb from limb. In the first 6 weeks alone, they murdered nearly 3,000 clergy, 861 in July, 2,077 in August. And listen, these numbers aren't some kind of propaganda. They're carved into the Vatican's own records of martyrs, confirmed by the very same church that would later declare nearly 1,000 of these victims to be saints. They dragged a priest, Father Pedro Mariel, from the altar of his own church in Madrid, right in the middle of Mass. And from the convents came screams that the stones themselves would remember forever. This, my friends, is the true story of the Red Terror, what was likely the largest, most concentrated slaughter of clergy in European history, the calculated, furious, and profane annihilation of nearly 7,000 priests, monks, and nuns in the span of less than 3 years. And yes, buried within that horror are the documented accounts of nuns and Catholic women being violated before they were executed. Crimes so fundamentally vile that even some Republican commanders couldn't bear to watch, while others just laughed and called it revolutionary justice. If you think you can handle the raw truth of it, then stay with me. If this is the kind of history you're here for, the kind that doesn't pull its punches, drop a 1 in the comments below. And if you want me to keep digging into these stories, the ones most channels are afraid to even touch, let me know with a 2. All right, let's get into it. You have to understand, Spain had been sick for a very long time. For 100 years, the church had been the very backbone of the old world. It was the biggest landowner, the banker, the censor, the trusted advisor to kings and strongmen. So when the Second Republic rose up in 1931, it felt like it came carrying torches, ready to burn it all down. They seized convents, kicked out the Jesuits, and tore crucifixes from the walls of schools. And the same crowds that cheered for it all in 1931 were the very same people who, just 5 years later, when the generals made their move and the Republic started to fracture, decided that the time for half measures was officially over. July 18th, 1936. The military's coup sputters and fails in the major cities. In Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Bilbao, the workers rise up, seizing weapons from the armories. The government just dissolves, shattering into 100 different revolutionary committees. And in the blink of an eye, the church, every single priest, every monk, every nun was declared an enemy of the people. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I mean it literally. The hunt was on. In the first 6 weeks alone, they murdered nearly 3,000 clergy, 861 in July, 2,077 in August. And listen, these numbers aren't some kind of propaganda. They're carved into the Vatican's own records of martyrs, confirmed by the very same church that would later declare nearly 1,000 of these victims to be saints. They dragged a priest, Father Pedro Mariel, from the altar of his own church in Madrid, right in the middle of Mass. In the tangled streets of Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Toledo, Malaga, and in tiny villages whose names would soon only be spoken in whispers and prayers, the air grew thick with the smell of kerosene, gunpowder, and a deep, spreading dread. Churches didn't just burn, they roared into the night like funeral pyres, and the bells that had marked the hours for centuries fell silent, crashing to the cobblestones and melting into shapes you'd see in a nightmare. And in Toledo, they nailed a priest to the door of his own church and just left him there for 3 days. His body, hanging as stray dogs, came to gnaw at his feet. But the deepest, darkest strain of hatred that was saved for the nuns. The militiamen had convinced themselves that the convents were hiding caches of weapons, stashes of gold, fascist spies, and the most thrilling prize of all. They believed they would find proof that these so-called brides of Christ were nothing more than hypocrites, living secret, sordid lie. So they kicked down the doors, hunting for evidence of secret pregnancies, for hidden lovers, for absolutely anything that would give them an excuse to do what they had already decided they were going to do. They almost never found anything. But that didn't stop them, not for a second. In Peralta de la Salle, Huesca, 3 Sisters of the Immaculate Heart were pulled from their convent on August 22nd, 1936. Militiamen from a local anarchist column took turns with them, right there in the town square, forcing the villagers to stand and watch the entire ordeal. Afterward, they shot the sisters in the back of the head and left their bodies exposed, their habits pushed up around their waists as a grotesque warning. 5 more sisters from that same convent endured the exact same brutal ritual before they too were executed. And this isn't rumor, it's all documented, recorded, and testified to under oath in the official inquiries and later in the Vatican's own beatification files. In Madrid, that November of 1936, 14 Franciscan Conceptionist nuns from the convent on Calle Bravo Murillo, their ages ranging from just 21 to 71, were herded into a truck and driven out to the Aravaca cemetery. On the way, several of them were assaulted in the back of that truck. When one of the younger sisters, a 23-year-old named Sister María Gabriela de Hinojosa, pleaded with them to at least spare the older women, they just laughed in her face and said, "Tonight, all of you are marrying the revolution." They were lined up against the cemetery wall and shot. Their bodies lay there for days before they were found, their habits torn, their legs splayed, with cigarette burns on their chests. The Vatican has photographs. I've seen them, and you don't ever forget images like that. In Barbastro, 87% of the local clergy, 123 out of 140 priests, were executed, most of them Claretian missionaries. Before their own murders, several were forced to watch as militiamen assaulted local Catholic girls who had done nothing more than try to bring the condemned men some food. One seminarian, only 22 years old, was mutilated while he was still alive and then taunted, "Go on, sing your hymns now, you little virgin." Then there was Valencia, a community of adoratrices, nuns, women who had dedicated their entire lives to helping prostitutes get off the streets, were accused of being prostitutes themselves. The militia stormed their convent, lined the sisters up, ripped the habits from their bodies, and violated them. And in Toledo, at the Hospital de Tavera, run by the Brothers of Street, John of God, who cared for the mentally ill patients no one else would even go near, the militia showed up, murdered every last one of the brothers, assaulted several of the female nurses who were just lay Catholic volunteers, and then they set the entire hospital on fire, with all the patients still locked inside. Over 200 mentally ill people were burned alive, while the bodies of the brothers who had cared for them were tossed into the Tagus River. I know this is hard to hear, but these aren't exaggerations, these are documented events. The Causa General, that massive investigation after the war, collected hundreds of sworn testimonies about the violation of nuns and ordinary Catholic women. The Vatican's own case files for the beatification of the Spanish martyrs contain eyewitness accounts that will make your skin crawl. Even historians who are deeply critical of the church, guys like Paul Preston or Anthony Beaver, they acknowledge that this sexual violence against nuns happened. They argue it was just less common than the outright slaughter, because most militias preferred a more symbolic humiliation, like stripping the sisters naked and parading them through the streets before shooting them. But when it happened, it was always a deliberate, ritualistic desecration. The men who did these things weren't some alien monsters. They were the guy next door who drove the tram, the local baker who was in debt to the church, the school teacher who'd been fined for teaching religion, the teenage kid who had watched his father lose the family farm on a mortgage held by the local monks. Militiamen from a local anarchist column took turns with them, right there in the town square, forcing the villagers to stand and watch the entire ordeal. Afterward, they shot the sisters in the back of the head and left their bodies exposed, their habits pushed up around their waists as a grotesque warning. By Christmas of 1936, the pace of the killings had slowed down, but it never truly stopped. Over the course of the entire war, 283 nuns were murdered, a number that seems small next to the 4,000, 184 priests, and 2,365 monks who were killed. But every single one of those deaths was a deliberate, calculated insult to everything the revolution despised. 13 bishops were executed. Entire seminaries were just erased. The clergy in dioceses like Barbastro, Lleida, Toledo, and Malaga were practically wiped off the face of the earth. In some villages, there wasn't a single priest left alive to say a mass or to bury the dead. The bodies were often just left in the streets for days. As a warning, in Barcelona, they actually dug up the mummified remains of nuns from the previous century, dressed them up in gaudy party clothes, and propped them up in cafes like some kind of grotesque art installation. In Madrid, they forced priests to dig their own graves, and then, right in front of the condemned men, they violated the laywomen who had come to beg for their lives before shooting everyone and pushing them into the same pit. But through all of this, the church itself didn't break. Thousands of priests and nuns simply went into hiding, continuing their work underground, saying mass in secret basements, hearing confessions in coal cellars, baptizing newborn babies in bathtubs. And when Franco's troops finally marched into these towns, the surviving Catholics would pour into the streets, weeping and kissing the soldiers' boots, not because they had some great love for fascism, but because the only other choice they'd known had been a living hell. The Red Terror claimed the lives of 6,832 verified members of the Catholic clergy and religious orders. Thousands more lay Catholics, women who wore religious medals, men who dared to attend Mass, girls who were part of Catholic youth groups, were violated, mutilated, and executed. We'll never know the real number of women who were assaulted. The ones who survived, they almost never spoke of it. Shame is a prison, and it keeps its secrets well. But the testimonies are there, the medical reports are there, the photographs are there. The official cases for sainthood contain details that the Vatican itself decided were too horrific to publish, too dark for the public to ever read. This wasn't just the random chaos of war, this was a revolution devouring its enemies with a special kind of hatred, a hatred you can only really describe as demonic. They didn't just want the church to be gone, they wanted it to be humiliated, to be degraded, to be proven a lie in the most intimate, violating, and soul-crushing way imaginable. And yet, their blood could not extinguish their faith. When the war finally shuddered to a halt in 1939, the churches were skeletal ruins, the seminaries were hollowed out, the convents were tombs of silence. But in the space of a single decade, a profound and defiant life returned, filling those empty halls once more as young men and women rose to take the place of the martyrs, proving that the blood they shed was not an end, but a seed. Today, the church remembers. Nearly 1,000 souls taken during the Red Terror have now been beatified, the largest single group of martyrs ever to be recognized at one time. Sister María Gabriela and her 13 companions were among them, their names finally sanctified in 2013. Their relics now rest in Madrid, a quiet testament where people still come to pray and where miracles have been known to happen. And the men who brought them such violence and death, most carried their unrepentant secrets to the grave, consumed by the war or the purges that followed, while others lived out long lives under Franco, forever haunted by the silence of what they did in 1936. A few, only a few, whispered their regret on their deathbeds. But there is one story of a former militiaman who years later returned to the very convent where he'd taken part in the massacre, fell to his knees before the Mother Superior, and begged for a forgiveness he did not deserve. And she gave it to him. That is also a part of this story. The revolution promised a world of liberty. It delivered a living hell. The church promised an eternity. It delivered its saints. And Spain, poor, bleeding Spain, she still carries the scars. You know, if you made it this far, you're different. You're not like most. If this story shook something loose inside you, just comment the word 1. Comment 2 if you think it's time we talked about the White Terror, because yes, the other side has blood on its hands, and I have no intention of hiding that from you. Subscribe, but only if you're truly ready to look straight into the abyss of what we've done to each other, and not blink. Because someone has to remember, the militia forced his congregation to watch as they mutilated him on the marble steps, forced the severed parts of his own body into his mouth, and then shot him 17 times. One shot, they screamed, "For every century the church had oppressed the people." In Ciudad Real, they made priests swallow their rosary beads until they choked to death. In Toledo, they hacked off the hands of monks before throwing them down abandoned mine shafts.